mentioned that one of the problems of a long-term consequence from corporal punishment is an attitude that accepts hitting spouses, and actually the behavior of twice as much hitting of spouses by people who had corporal punishment as adolescents. That's a very important factor. Think about our divorce rate. In fact, this kind of abuse of spouses was going on before, but now people have the ability in more cases to get out of those relationships. But divorce is bad for children too, and so is viewing of family violence.
One of the most interesting aspects of the effects of corporal punishment is the relationship to hitting a spouse, a wife or a husband, as an adult. It's interesting because we've been able to trace out the processes that make that connection. It's been known for many years, but ignored, that people who are hit by their parents a lot are much more likely to hit their wife or hit their husband. And we haven't known why that is. So in some recent research, we've nailed down some of the processes. One of the processes is corporal punishment establishes the legitimacy, the moral rightness of hitting other people who misbehave. Now, when you misbehave, okay, you're going to get it, Jimmy. That principle is learned. The problem is that little Jimmy isn't the only one that misbehaves. All husbands misbehave sooner or later as the wife sees it. All wives misbehave sooner or later as the husband sees it. And when that happens, if they have learned that the way to deal with persistent misbehavior is to hit, then the probability of doing that is much greater. This is one of the findings of that study. We found that there's one of the processes is that corporal punishment produces a big increase in approval of violence, of hitting to correct misbehavior. The exact question we asked this national sample was, can you think of any circumstance in which it would be okay for a husband to slap his wife's face? And the second question, can you think of any circumstances when it would be okay for a wife to slap her husband's face? And about a fifth of the U.S. population say they can think of a circumstance. It's a fifth. On the other hand, among people who were at the high quarter of corporal punishment, the 1/4 hit most often, it goes up to about half who agree that there are circumstances when it's okay to slap a spouse's face. And in turn, people who believe that, it's not surprising to find out more of them actually do it.
It's very clear that there's a relationship, not a one-to-one relationship, but a substantial relationship between violence towards children and what's now called domestic violence, violence between domestic partners. If you experienced corporal punishment when you were a child, you're more likely to grow up to use violence towards a domestic partner. If you're using violence towards a domestic partner, you're more likely to be using violence towards your own child. So there is this very close connection. Ironically, there is no close connection in the advocacy or public policy arena. The domestic violence advocates rarely concern themselves with child maltreatment, know very little about who's involved in child rights issues, and the same is true for the child rights advocates. Those folks who are working on behalf of children very rarely become involved and know very little about domestic violence. But if you put them side by side, there's an extraordinary mismatch in favor of battered women and not in favor of children. The advocacy movement to prevent and treat domestic violence has up until now pretty much ignored the issue of child maltreatment to the detriment. Now, clearly, battered women need a place to go. Battered women need advocacy. Battered women need court advocacy. Battered women need shelters. No one in their right mind would argue that we should subtract services for battered women. But if your goal really is to protect women from domestic assault, then prevention should begin at point zero, which is, let's not raise little boys to learn that it's okay for big, powerful people to hit smaller, less powerful people. The domestic violence movement naturally should be involved in the child rights movement, trying to prevent abusive men from developing into abusive men. And it's one of the real dilemmas and shortcomings of our 20-year effort to deal with family violence, that there hasn't been a close connection. There hasn't even been an awareness by many of those in the domestic violence movement that child maltreatment is an issue. And there's no reason to think that money would be taken away from the Violence Against Women Act to provide services to prevent child maltreatment. There's a good deal of research now that shows that boys who are hit as adolescents are more likely to hit their dates and more likely to become spouse abusers. Probably less well known is the research that young women who observe their parents hit one another and who themselves were hit are more likely to grow up to be victims and offenders of spouse abuse. We haven't talked very much about women as if they didn't use any violence. They use quite a bit of it, and it grows out of how much they experience. I mean, the domestic violence community would like to have a perceptual blackout regarding females as offenders. There are female offenders, but they're produced the same way male offenders are produced. They're taught that power comes from power comes by being able to physically dominate another person.
Okay, another issue having to do with discipline of children and the whole problem of anger and control is spouse abuse. And I've dealt with many, many cases of this. I'm familiar with the literature on it. And there's no question that spouse abusers come from backgrounds where there's been abuse in their own lives. And there's no question that there's very often at least one kid in a family where spouse is abused, there's at least one target kid that's abused also. And very often it's lots of them. This is all tied together, and then the root cause is inability to control impulses. And people who are spouse abusers, although the research hasn't shown there's any particular pathology with them, but as a group, they have trouble controlling their impulses. And they want to be in control, because usually as kids, they learn that from their parents. And I've seen plenty of patients where I've been told stories of fathers coming home Friday night after drinking, lining all the kids up, giving them a good whack, and I'd say, what for? And just to whack them. And then later on at night, the kids are lying in their beds and they're hearing their mother being beaten. So there's no question that there's just nothing good about hitting. It encourages the feeling that you can have physical control and inflict pain. And we know from history, when you give the power to inflict physical pain on others, that power is always abused. We know it from at the individual level, and we know at the societal level. The more power you give officials of government to inflict pain, the more abusive they become. And so we know that, and in order to deal with the problem of spouse abuse, we need to also deal with the problem of abusive children in terms of spanking, because those things all fit together.
When parents rely on punishment, what effect does that have on the children? What are they teaching the children? One of the things they're teaching the children that might makes right, that the way you control other people requires power, and this means power over somebody else. And you're teaching them it's all right to use your power to control somebody else's behavior. And of course now we know that children who are hit, children who are punished, physically punished, very often become physically punishing husbands in the husband-wife relationship.